The access card reader blinked red again, its harsh beep echoing through the empty hallway like a judgment. I fumbled through my wallet, fingers trembling slightly as I searched for the thin plastic rectangle that should have been there. My gym bag slipped from my shoulder, hitting the polished concrete floor with a dull thud that seemed to reverberate through the entire building. It was 11:47 p.m., and the hallway lights had already dimmed to their nighttime setting, casting everything in a sickly amber glow. I'd forgotten my apartment access card. Again. Third time this month. The building manager had warned residents about the new security protocols, but somehow the information never seemed to stick in my brain, sliding off like water on glass. I pressed my forehead against the cool metal door, feeling the weight of another small failure settling into my chest. This was exactly the kind of thing that happened to people like me, people who moved through the world as quietly as possible, hoping not to be noticed, only to find that invisibility came with its own set of problems. When you didn't matter to anyone, no one remembered to help you when you needed it most. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made me straighten up, panic fluttering in my throat like a trapped bird. Someone was coming up from the lower level, their steps measured and deliberate. I grabbed my gym bag, pressing myself against the wall as if I could somehow disappear into the painted drywall. The footsteps grew closer, and I caught sight of broad shoulders rounding the corner. It was him, the man from 4B, the one I'd been noticing for months but had never spoken to. He was older than me, maybe early 30s, with dark hair that always looked slightly mussed and eyes that seemed to carry some invisible weight. I'd seen him coming and going at odd hours, just like me, two ships passing in the fluorescent-lit hallways of this anonymous building. He stopped when he saw me standing there, key card in one hand, gym bag in the other, looking every bit as lost as I felt. "Locked out?" His voice was deeper than I'd expected, with a slight rasp that suggested he'd been up as late as I had. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without my voice cracking. There was something about unexpected human contact that always caught me off guard, like stepping into bright sunlight after hours in darkness. "I can let you in," he said, fishing his own card from the pocket of his jeans. "I'm Chris, by the way. 4B. "I know," I said, then immediately regretted it because it sounded like I'd been watching him. Which I had, but not in a creepy way, more like the way you notice the same bird outside your window every morning, a small constant in an otherwise shifting world. "I mean, I've seen you around. I'm in 3A. Chris swiped his card and held the door open for me, waiting as I gathered my things and stepped through. The hallway beyond was exactly the same as the one we'd just left. Beige walls, industrial carpet, the lingering smell of cleaning products and other people's cooking, but somehow it felt different now that I wasn't alone in it. "You're up late," he observed as we walked toward the elevator bank. It wasn't quite a question, but there was an invitation in his tone, a gentle probe that suggested he might actually want to know the answer. "Couldn't sleep," I said, which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I'd been lying in bed for 3 hours, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the city beyond my window, feeling like I was drowning in the silence of my own life. The gym had seemed like a better alternative than another hour of that particular brand of self-torture. "Me neither." Chris pressed the up button, and we stood there waiting for the elevator in the kind of comfortable silence that felt rare and precious. Most silences in my life were awkward, filled with the pressure of things unsaid and connections unmade. But this felt different. Two people simply existing in the same space without the need to perform or explain themselves. The elevator arrived with a soft ding and we stepped inside. Chris pressed the button for my floor first, which was a small kindness that I probably noticed more than I should have. In the enclosed space, I could smell his cologne, something clean and understated, like soap and cedar, and feel the warmth radiating from his body. He was wearing a faded gray t-shirt that had seen better days, and there was something about the softness of the worn fabric that made me want to reach out and touch it. The gym? He asked, nodding at my bag. Yeah, you? Same. He smiled, and it transformed his entire face, erasing some of the weariness I'd noticed before. There's something about working out when the world's quiet, you know? Like you can actually hear yourself think. I did know. That was exactly why I'd started going so late. Why I'd chosen this building in the first place. Close enough to the 24-hour gym that I could walk there when sleep wouldn't come, when the walls of my apartment started feeling too close and the silence too loud. Which gym? I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. Fit Life on 5th. The one with the broken air conditioning and the mirrors that make everyone look slightly green. That's the one. I felt something that might have been the beginning of a smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. I thought I was the only one masochistic enough to work out there regularly. Nah, there's at least 2 of us. The elevator dinged softly as we reached the 3rd floor. Though I have to say the late-night crowd is definitely more interesting than the rush hour people. The doors slid open, revealing my floor, identical to his but somehow more familiar, more mine. I stepped out but found myself turning back toward him, reluctant to let this unexpected moment of connection end. Maybe I'll see you there, I said, the words coming out more hopeful than I'd intended. Maybe you will. His smile was warm, genuine in a way that made something in my chest loosen slightly. Have a good workout. The elevator doors closed between us, and I was alone again in the hallway. But this time the solitude felt different, less like an ending and more like a pause, a held breath before something new might begin. 3 days later, I found myself at Fit Life at nearly midnight, my usual time, telling myself it had nothing to do with Chris and everything to do with my inability to sleep. The gym was mostly empty except for a few die-hard insomniacs and shift workers grabbing exercise between obligations. I went through my usual routine, treadmill, weights, the ancient rowing machine that creaked like a sailing ship in a storm. I was on my 2nd set of bench presses when I saw him. Chris was across the room at the squat rack, his back to me, moving through his routine with the kind of focused intensity that suggested this was meditation as much as exercise. He was wearing the same faded gray t-shirt, and I found myself wondering if he owned several identical ones, or if this particular shirt was just his favorite. I finished my set and sat up, grabbing my water bottle and trying not to stare. But there was something compelling about the way he moved. Economical, purposeful, like someone who understood exactly what his body was capable of and didn't need to prove anything to anyone else. He must have sensed my attention because he turned around, catching my eye across the room. For a moment, we just looked at each other, and I felt that strange electric recognition that sometimes happens between strangers, the sense that you're seeing someone, really seeing them for the first time. He raised his hand in a small wave, and I waved back, feeling suddenly self-conscious about my sweat-dampened shirt and the fact that I'd been caught looking. But Chris just smiled and went back to his workout, and I went back to mine, though I found it harder to concentrate with him in my peripheral vision. I was loading plates onto the bar for my final set when he appeared beside me, towel draped around his neck, looking like he'd finished his own routine. "Need a spot?" he asked, nodding toward the bench. I almost said no. I'd been working out alone for so long that having someone else involved felt strange, intimate in a way I wasn't sure I was ready for. But there was something in his expression, a kind of gentle patience, that made me nod instead. "Thanks. I'm going for 10 reps. Chris positioned himself behind the bench, his hands hovering just below the bar, ready to help if I needed it. I lay back and gripped the bar, suddenly aware of how close he was, the warmth of his presence above me. When I lifted the weight, I could feel him there, a steady presence ready to catch me if I faltered. The first few reps were easy, but by the 7th, my muscles were burning. On the 9th, my arms started to shake, and I felt Chris's fingers brush mine as he helped guide the bar back to the rack. "Good work," he said as I sat up, and there was something in his voice, approval, maybe, or recognition, that made warmth spread through my chest in a way that had nothing to do with the exercise. Thanks for the spot. I grabbed my towel, using it to hide the flush I could feel creeping up my neck. I probably would have dropped that last one without you. Doubt it. You're stronger than you think. Chris settled onto the bench beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I've seen you here before, working out alone. You push yourself pretty hard. The observation caught me off guard. I'd assumed I was invisible here, just another late-night gym patron going through the motions. The idea that Chris had not only noticed me, but had been paying attention to my workouts was both thrilling and terrifying. I like the quiet, I said, which was true, but not complete. The complete truth was that I liked not having to worry about anyone watching me, judging my form or my effort, or the way I looked when I was pushing myself to my limits. The late-night gym was a sanctuary of sorts, a place where I could exist without performance or pretense. Me too. Chris was quiet for a moment, staring across the nearly empty gym floor. There's something honest about this time of night. Like all the bullshit falls away and you're left with just the essential stuff. I knew exactly what he meant, though I'd never been able to articulate it that way. The late hours stripped away all the social complexity, all the careful navigation of other people's expectations and moods. It was just you and the weights and the steady rhythm of your own breathing. You work nights? I asked, though I was pretty sure he didn't. I'd seen him coming home during daylight hours too often for him to be a traditional night shift worker. No, I'm a firefighter. 24 on, 48 off. Chris wiped his face with his towel, and I caught a glimpse of a scar running along his forearm, pale and raised, the kind that came from something serious. But sleep's been difficult lately, so I figured I might as well do something productive with the insomnia. There was a weight to the way he said it, a suggestion of stories he wasn't ready to tell. I recognized that particular brand of careful revelation, giving just enough truth to satisfy curiosity without opening yourself up to questions you weren't ready to answer. I'm a nursing student, I offered in return. Finals are coming up, so I'm basically running on caffeine and anxiety. Exercise helps with the anxiety part. Nursing. Chris nodded approvingly. That's good work. Hard work, but good. What made you become a firefighter? The question slipped out before I could stop it, and I immediately regretted it. We were still strangers, really, despite the comfortable way we were talking, but Chris didn't seem to mind the question. Honestly, I wanted to help people, but I'm not smart enough to be a doctor and not patient enough to be a teacher. His smile was self-deprecating but warm. Firefighting seemed like a good fit. Get to help people, work with a team, and there's enough physical challenge to keep things interesting. You like the team aspect? Most days. He paused, and I caught something in his expression, a flicker of something complex and painful. Some days are better than others. We sat there in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the few remaining gym patrons go through their routines. The late-night crowd was a particular breed, focused, solitary, moving through their exercises with the kind of determination that suggested they were working out demons as much as muscles. I should probably head home, Chris said eventually, though he didn't make any move to get up. Early shift tomorrow. Yeah, me too. I also stayed seated, reluctant to break this unexpected moment of connection. Thanks again for the spot. Anytime. Chris stood and gathered his things, slinging his gym bag over his shoulder. He started to walk away, then turned back. Hey, if you're ever here and need someone to work out with, I'm usually here around this time when I can't sleep. It's better than lying in bed staring at the ceiling. I'd like that, I said, the words coming out more quickly than I'd intended. I mean, if you don't mind the company. I don't mind at all. His smile was warm, genuine, and for a moment, I felt like I was seeing him clearly. Not just the surface Chris, the firefighter with the easy smile and the careful way of moving through the world, but something deeper. something lonely and hopeful and trying, just like me. After he left, I finished my workout in the suddenly quiet gym, but my mind wasn't on the exercises. I kept thinking about the way Chris had spotted me, the gentle pressure of his hands ready to help, the casual intimacy of sitting beside him on the bench. It had been a long time since anyone had shown me that kind of easy kindness, and I wasn't sure what to do with the way it made me feel. The next night, I found myself getting ready for the gym with more care than usual. I'd changed shirts twice, finally settling on a navy blue t-shirt that I thought brought out my eyes, then immediately felt ridiculous for caring. I was going to work out, not on a date. The fact that Chris might be there was irrelevant. Except it wasn't irrelevant at all. As I walked the 3 blocks to Fit Life, I found myself hoping he would be there, imagining what we might talk about, wondering if the easy connection I'd felt the night before had been real or just a product of my own loneliness and wishful thinking. The gym was busier than usual for a midnight crowd, maybe 8 or 9 people scattered across the equipment instead of the usual 3 or 4. I scanned the room as I signed in, trying to look casual, but Chris wasn't there. I felt a sharp stab of disappointment that I immediately tried to push away. He had a life, a job, responsibilities. The world didn't revolve around my need for human connection. I went through my usual warm-up routine on the treadmill, trying to focus on the rhythm of my feet against the belt, the steady beeping of the machine as it tracked my pace. But I kept glancing toward the entrance, hoping to see those familiar broad shoulders and that slightly mussed dark hair. I was halfway through my weight routine when he appeared. I caught sight of him in the mirror as he signed in, and felt something in my chest relax, like I'd been holding my breath without realizing it. He was wearing different clothes tonight, a black t-shirt that looked newer than his usual gray one, and dark workout shorts that showed off legs that were clearly the product of years of physical labor. Our eyes met in the mirror, and he smiled, raising his hand in the same small wave he'd given me the night before. I waved back, trying to look casual, like my heart hadn't just picked up speed for reasons that had nothing to do with exercise. Chris went through his warm-up routine while I continued my sets, but there was an awareness between us now, a subtle gravitational pull that kept drawing my attention across the room. When he moved to the free weights section, I found myself timing my rest periods to coincide with his, creating opportunities for conversation. "How was your shift?" I asked as we passed each other between exercises. "Long," Chris said, but he was smiling. "House fire in Hillcrest. Nobody hurt, but it took most of the day to get it under control." I wanted to ask more, about the fire, about his work, about what it felt like to run toward danger when everyone else was running away. But something in his expression told me he needed this space to be separate from that world, a place where he could just be Chris, not firefighter Chris with all the weight and responsibility that came with it. "I'm glad you made it out in time for the good workout hours," I said instead, and he laughed. A real laugh, not the polite chuckle you give strangers. "The good workout hours?" "You know, when all the muscle heads have gone home and stopped hogging the squat rack?" "Ah, yes, the sacred late-night hours when mere mortals can actually use the equipment." Chris wiped his face with his towel, and I tried not to notice the way the movement pulled his shirt tight across his chest. Though I have to say, some of those muscleheads are actually pretty nice guys. They just happen to be very enthusiastic about protein shakes and talking loudly about their gains. "You sound like you speak from experience." "I used to work out during normal hours. Before." He trailed off, something shifting in his expression. "Before I developed my current sleep schedule." There was a story there I could tell, something that had changed his patterns, driven him to seek out the quiet hours when the world was mostly asleep. But I recognized the careful way he'd closed off that particular avenue of conversation, and I didn't push. We worked out in companionable silence for a while, moving through our respective routines but staying within easy conversation distance. There was something comfortable about his presence, not intrusive or demanding, just there. Available if I wanted to talk, content with quiet if I didn't. I was setting up for bench press when Chris appeared with his towel. Need another spot? I nodded, settling back on the bench as he took his position behind the bar. This time I was more prepared for the intimacy of having him so close, for the warmth of his body above mine, and the careful way his hands hovered near the bar, ready to help. But I wasn't prepared for the moment when our eyes met as I pushed through the difficult 7th rep. There was something in his gaze, intense, focused, but also gentle, that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. Not just noticed, but truly seen, as if he was looking past all my careful walls and defenses to something essential underneath. I finished the set and sat up, suddenly aware of how close we were. Chris hadn't stepped back after helping me rack the weight, and we were maybe 2 feet apart, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes and smell that clean cedar scent that seemed to follow him. "Good work," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice, approval, warmth, maybe something more, that made heat spread through my chest. "Thanks for the spot." My voice came out rougher than I'd intended, and I saw Chris's gaze flicker down to my mouth before meeting my eyes again. We stayed like that for a moment, caught in some kind of suspended tension, neither of us moving away, but neither making any move forward either. I could feel my heart beating against my ribs, and I wondered if Chris could hear it, if he could sense the way my entire nervous system seemed to be lighting up just from his proximity. Then someone dropped a weight on the other side of the gym, the sharp clang breaking whatever spell had settled over us. Chris stepped back, running a hand through his hair, and I looked down at my hands, suddenly fascinated by my calluses. "I should probably finish up," Chris said, though he didn't sound like he particularly wanted to. "Yeah, me too." But neither of us moved. We just stood there, the air between us charged with something I couldn't quite name but didn't want to lose. "Walk out together?" Chris asked, and I nodded, relieved that he'd found a way to extend our time without making it seem like anything more than casual friendliness. We finished our routines and gathered our things, moving through the familiar ritual of post-workout cleanup. The gym was nearly empty now, just us and one dedicated soul still grinding away on the elliptical machine with headphones on, lost in their own world. Outside, the night air was cool and clean, a relief after the close atmosphere of the gym. We stood there for a moment, both of us seeming reluctant to head in different directions. "Which way are you headed?" Chris asked. "Tower Apartments. You?" "Same direction." He fell into step beside me as we started walking, and I tried not to read too much into it. We lived in the same building. Of course, we were going in the same direction. But as we walked, our conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from favorite movies to theories about why the gym's air conditioning had been broken for 3 months straight. Chris was funny in a quiet, observational way, pointing out small absurdities in our surroundings that I would never have noticed on my own. "See that window?" He pointed to a 3rd-floor apartment in the building across from ours. "Every night, same time, someone turns on a lamp, leaves it on for exactly 20 minutes, then turns it off. I've been trying to figure out what they're doing for weeks." I looked up at the window in question, currently dark. Maybe they're feeding a pet? 20 minutes would be about right for a complicated aquarium routine. Or they're a spy, sending coded messages to other spies. Chris's tone was serious, but I could hear the smile in his voice. 20 minutes is exactly how long it would take to encrypt and transmit the day's intelligence. Or they're just really, really slow at getting ready for bed. That's the most boring explanation, and therefore probably the correct one. We'd reached our building, but neither of us made a move toward the entrance. I found myself reluctant to end this easy conversation, this unexpected pocket of connection in what had been a fairly lonely stretch of weeks. "Thanks for walking back with me," I said, "and for the spot earlier." Again. "Thanks for the company." It's nice to have someone to talk to during the weird hours. There was something wistful in the way he said it, a loneliness that resonated with something in my own chest. I wanted to ask him about it, about why he was awake at these hours, about what had changed in his life to drive him to seek out solitude and exercise in the middle of the night. But those felt like questions for another time, when we knew each other better. "Maybe I'll see you tomorrow night," I said instead. "Maybe you will." Chris smiled, and there was something in his expression, warm, hopeful, maybe a little uncertain, that made me think he was hoping for the same thing I was. That this wasn't just chance encounters at the gym, but the beginning of something that might grow into friendship, or maybe something more. I was almost to the elevator when I heard him call my name. I turned back to find him still standing by the entrance, looking like he was wrestling with some internal decision. "You don't have to answer this," he said, his voice careful. "But do you ever feel like you're just going through the motions? Like you're living your life on autopilot?" The question caught me completely off guard, partly because it was so unexpected, but mostly because it hit so close to home. That was exactly how I'd been feeling for months, like I was sleepwalking through my days, moving from obligation to obligation without any real sense of purpose or connection. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Yeah, I do." Chris nodded, as if my answer had confirmed something for him. "I thought so. There's something about the way you move through the world, like you're trying not to disturb anything." I didn't know what to say to that. He'd seen something in me that I'd thought I was hiding, some essential loneliness that I'd been carrying around like a secret. "Is that bad?" I asked. "No, just recognizable." We looked at each other across the lobby, and I felt that electric recognition again, that sense of seeing and being seen. Chris was lonely too, I realized. For all his easy smiles and confident presence, he was carrying his own weight of isolation, his own sense of disconnect from the world around him. "Good night," he said finally, and I could hear the reluctance in his voice. "Good night." I rode the elevator up to my floor, but instead of going straight to my apartment, I found myself standing by the window at the end of the hallway, looking down at the street below. A few minutes later, I saw Chris emerge from the building, walking slowly toward the parking garage. Even from 4 floors up, there was something solitary about his figure, something that made me want to call out to him, to invite him up for coffee or conversation, or just more of the easy companionship we'd found at the gym. But I didn't. I just watched him disappear into the garage, then went to my apartment and lay awake for another 2 hours, thinking about the way he'd looked at me during that bench press, and the question he'd asked about going through the motions, and the loneliness I'd seen in his eyes that matched the loneliness in my own. Thursday night, I arrived at the gym to find Chris already there, working through what looked like a leg routine with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was working out more than just his muscles. He looked up when I signed in, giving me that now familiar smile and wave. But there was something different about his energy tonight. More wound up, like he was carrying some kind of tension that needed to be burned off through physical exertion. I went through my warm-up, stealing glances at him in the mirror. His movements were more aggressive tonight, pushing heavier weight with sharp, controlled motions that spoke of frustration or anger being channeled into something productive. When he finished his set and sat back on the leg press machine, his jaw was tight and there were lines of stress around his eyes that hadn't been there the night before. I finished my cardio and moved to the free weights section, positioning myself close enough to Chris that conversation would be natural if he wanted it, but not so close that I'd be intruding if he preferred to work alone. "Rough day?" I asked as he moved to the squat rack. Chris paused in his setup, looking at me with something that might have been gratitude. "You could say that." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push. Instead, I started my own routine, staying close enough that he could talk if he wanted to, but giving him the space to work through whatever was eating at him. We worked in parallel for about 20 minutes, the comfortable silence occasionally broken by the sound of weights being racked or the soft grunt of effort. But I could feel the tension radiating off Chris like heat, Could see it in the rigid set of his shoulders and the way he was pushing himself harder than usual. Finally, he set down his weights and leaned against the squat rack, running both hands through his hair in a gesture that looked like frustration. "Sorry," he said. "I'm not great company tonight." You don't have to be great company. Sometimes the gym is just about working shit out. Chris looked at me with something that might have been surprise, as if he hadn't expected me to understand. But I did understand. I'd had plenty of nights where the only thing standing between me and complete emotional collapse was the mindless repetition of lifting and lowering weights until my body was too tired for my brain to keep spinning. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's exactly what it is." "Want to talk about it or just want to work it out?" Chris considered this, weighing his options. "Talk, maybe. If you don't mind listening to me complain." "I don't mind." Chris sat down on the bench and I joined him, close enough that our knees were almost touching. The gym was particularly quiet tonight, just us and one other person working out with headphones on across the room. "We had a call today," Chris began, staring down at his hands. "Car accident on the 5th. Family of 4, kids in the back seat." He paused, and I could see him working to keep his voice steady. "Everyone was okay, mostly. Minor injuries, couple of broken bones. But for about 10 minutes there, we didn't know, and I was working on this little girl, maybe 6 years old, and she kept asking for her mom." I could hear the weight in his voice, the way the day had settled into his bones like lead. The mom was conscious, but trapped in the front seat. Couldn't get to her daughter. And this kid is scared and hurt, and calling for the one person who can't get to her. Chris rubbed his face with both hands. "We got them all out, like I said. Everyone's going to be fine. But I can't stop thinking about that 10 minutes when I didn't know if they would be." I'd heard similar stories from the nurses I'd worked with during my clinical rotations, moments when the job stopped being about protocol and procedures and became about holding someone's life in your hands, about being the barrier between a person and the worst thing that could happen to them. "That's a hell of a thing to carry around," I said. "It is. And most days I'm good at leaving it at work, you know. But some days." He shrugged, a gesture that tried to minimize what he was feeling but didn't quite succeed. "Some days it follows me home." "Is that why you can't sleep?" "The job?" Chris was quiet for a long moment, and I wondered if I'd pushed too far, asked something too personal for this still fragile friendship we were building. "Partly," he said finally. "The job's part of it. But there are other things, too." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. But I could see the weight of whatever those other things were in the way he held his shoulders, in the careful distance he maintained even in moments of connection. "For what it's worth," I said, "that little girl was lucky to have you there." Even if it was scary for a few minutes, she had someone who cared about getting her out safely. Chris looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something shift in his expression. Some of the tension eased from around his eyes, and his shoulders dropped slightly. "Thanks," he said. I needed to hear that. We sat there in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and I found myself studying Chris's profile, the strong line of his jaw and the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. There was something about him in this vulnerable moment that made me want to reach out, to offer some kind of physical comfort to go along with the words. But I didn't know if that would be welcome, didn't know what the boundaries were in this undefined thing between us. "Want to finish our workouts?" Chris asked eventually. "I think I've worked through the worst of it." "Sure." We spent the next hour moving through our respective routines, but the dynamic between us had shifted slightly. Chris seemed more relaxed now, more present, as if talking about his day had released some of the pressure that had been building inside him. And I felt more connected to him, trusted with something real and difficult in a way that made our friendship feel more substantial. When we finished and headed outside, the night air felt different, softer, warmer, despite the fact that it was the same temperature it had been when I'd arrived. "Thanks for listening tonight," Chris said as we walked back toward our building. "It helps, having someone to talk to who doesn't work in my world." "Any time. Really." "I mean it, though. I don't have a lot of people I can talk to about this stuff. The job, the weird hours, it doesn't leave a lot of room for normal friendships." I knew what he meant. My own schedule, between school and clinicals, and my tendency to seek out solitude during off hours, had made it difficult to maintain connections with people who lived more conventional lives. "Well, we're both weirdos with weird schedules," I said. "Maybe that makes us perfect friends for each other." Chris smiled, and there was something in his expression that made me think he was hoping for the same thing I was, that this easy companionship might grow into something more substantial, something that could provide an anchor point in lives that felt increasingly untethered. We'd reached our building, but neither of us made a move toward the entrance. This was becoming a pattern, finding reasons to extend our time together, reluctant to return to the solitude of our separate apartments. "Can I ask you something?" Chris said. "Sure." "The other night, when I asked about going through the motions, what did you mean when you said yes?" The question caught me off guard again, partly because I'd thought we were done with serious conversation for the night, but mostly because it required me to articulate something I'd been trying not to think about too clearly. "I don't know," I said slowly. "I guess I feel like I'm living someone else's life. Going through the steps of what I think I'm supposed to be doing, school, career, all of it, but not really present for any of it, like I'm watching it happen to someone who looks like me." Chris nodded as if that made perfect sense to him. "When did that start?" he asked. I had to think about it. When had I started feeling like a ghost in my own life? "Maybe always," I admitted. "But it got worse after I moved here. Starting over in a new city, not knowing anyone. I think I just got into the habit of not engaging. It was easier to stay on the periphery than to risk getting hurt trying to connect. But now? Now I'm not sure if I remember how to do anything else." Chris was quiet for a moment, and I wondered if I'd shared too much, revealed something that made me seem pathetic or damaged. "I get that," he said finally. "The staying on the periphery thing. It's safer there." "Is that what you do too?" "I used to be better at connecting. But some things happened, and it started feeling like too much work to let people get close. Like the risk wasn't worth it anymore." There was pain in his voice, old and deep and carefully managed. I wanted to ask what had happened. What had made someone as kind and thoughtful as Chris decide that connection wasn't worth the risk? But that felt like a question for another night, when we knew each other better. "Maybe we can figure out how to do it together," I said instead. The words hung between us like smoke in the dim light of his living room. "You don't have to go yet, if you don't want to." Chris stood there, backlit by the warm glow of a single table lamp, his hands fidgeting at his sides. The rain outside had softened to a gentle patter against the windows, but inside the silence felt thick enough to cut. I should have left. That would have been the smart thing to do, grab my jacket from the back of his couch, thank him for the bourbon and the conversation, and walk the 3 blocks back to my apartment through the drizzle. Keep things simple. Keep the boundaries clear. Instead, I found myself nodding, my throat suddenly dry despite the whiskey we'd been sharing. "Okay," I said, the word barely above a whisper. "I'll stay a little longer." The relief that crossed Chris's face was so brief I almost missed it. He ran a hand through his dark hair, graying at the temples now in a way that made him look distinguished rather than old. "Good," he said, then immediately looked embarrassed by his own eagerness. "I mean, it's still raining pretty hard out there. We both knew that wasn't why I was staying." He gestured toward the couch, and I settled back into the worn leather cushions that had molded themselves to countless evenings like this one. Though I suspected none of those evenings had carried quite the same electric undercurrent that seemed to pulse through the air between us now. Chris disappeared into the kitchen, and I heard the clink of ice cubes, the soft glug of liquid being poured. When he returned, he handed me a fresh glass of bourbon, our fingers brushing for just a moment longer than necessary. The touch sent a jolt up my arm that I tried to ignore, but Chris must have felt it too because he pulled his hand back quickly, almost spilling his drink. "Sorry," he muttered, settling onto the opposite end of the couch, careful to leave space between us. "Don't be sorry," I said, meeting his eyes. "There's nothing to apologize for." The look he gave me then was searching, vulnerable in a way that made my chest tighten. We'd been dancing around this thing between us for months, the lingering looks during our late-night gym sessions, the way our conversations had grown deeper and more personal, the excuses we both made to spend time together that had nothing to do with fitness or convenience. "I keep thinking I'm reading this all wrong," Chris said quietly, staring down at his glass. "That I'm seeing something that isn't there because I want it to be there so badly." The honesty in his voice cut right through me. I set my bourbon down on the coffee table and turned to face him fully. "What do you think you're seeing?" He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on the words before he let them out. "I think I'm seeing someone who might understand what it's like to feel invisible most of the time. Someone who knows what it means to want something you're not sure you deserve." The accuracy of his observation hit me like a physical blow. I'd spent so much of my adult life feeling like I was watching everyone else live from behind glass, present but somehow separate, always the observer rather than the participant. Even with Chris, even as our friendship had deepened, I'd maintained that careful distance that had become second nature to me. "You're not wrong," I admitted, my voice rougher than I intended. "About feeling invisible, I mean." Chris looked up at me then, and the understanding in his eyes was almost too much to bear. "When did it start for you?" he asked. "That feeling like you were on the outside looking in?" I thought about it, tracing back through the years to find the source. "I think it was gradual," I said finally. "Like erosion. Little by little, I just started stepping back from things, from people. It was easier than risking disappointment." "Or rejection," Chris added softly. "Yeah, especially that." The rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, creating a cocoon of sound that made the outside world feel very far away. Chris shifted on the couch, angling himself toward me, and I noticed he'd moved slightly closer. Not intentionally intimate, but near enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "Can I tell you something?" he said, his voice low. "Something I've never told anyone." I nodded, afraid that if I spoke, I might break whatever spell was settling over us. "After my divorce," Chris began, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass, "I convinced myself that I was better off alone. That maybe I'd used up my chance at connection and trying again would just end in more hurt. For years, I actually believed that. I built this whole life around not needing anyone." He paused, taking a sip of bourbon before continuing. "But then you started showing up at the gym, and everything I'd told myself about being fine on my own just crumbled. Suddenly, I was looking forward to seeing you, timing my workouts around yours, finding excuses to talk to you between sets. For the first time in years, I felt like I was waking up from something. The raw vulnerability in his confession made my heart pound so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Chris," I started, but he held up a hand. "I'm not trying to pressure you into anything," he said quickly. "I just needed you to know that whatever this is between us, it's not one-sided. At least not for me." I stared at him, this man who'd become so important to me without my even realizing it was happening. Chris, who showed up consistently and without expectation. Who listened when I talked and remembered the small details I shared. Who'd somehow managed to slip past all my carefully constructed defenses without ever making me feel unsafe or rushed. "It's not one-sided," I said, my voice barely audible over the rain. "It scares the hell out of me, but it's not one-sided." The smile that spread across Chris's face was like sunrise, slow and warm and transformative. He set his glass down on the coffee table next to mine and shifted closer, close enough that our knees were almost touching. "What scares you most about it?" he asked. I had to think about that for a moment, sorting through the tangle of fears and desires that had been building in my chest for months. "I think it's the hoping," I said finally. "I've gotten pretty good at not hoping for things. It's safer that way. But with you, I find myself hoping all the time, and I don't know how to handle that." Chris reached out then, his hand hovering just above mine where it rested on the couch between us. "Can I?" he asked, and when I nodded, his fingers settled over mine with the gentleness of someone handling something precious. The contact was simple, just skin against skin, but it sent warmth spreading up my arm and into my chest. His hand was larger than mine, calloused from years of physical work, and completely steady, despite the vulnerability of the moment. "I hope too," he said quietly. "More than I have in years." We sat like that for a while, hands touching, not saying anything. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt full instead of empty, charged with possibility rather than awkwardness. Outside, the rain began to ease, but neither of us moved to acknowledge it. "Would it be okay?" Chris said eventually, his thumb brushing across my knuckles, "if I told you some of the things I've been hoping for?" My pulse quickened, but I nodded. "I hope that this thing between us keeps growing," he said, his voice soft but steady. "I hope that someday I'll be brave enough to cook you dinner instead of just talking about it. I hope that maybe you'll let me take you somewhere nice, somewhere that matters to both of us." He paused, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "And I hope," he continued, "that eventually we'll both stop being so afraid of wanting something good." The sincerity in his words, the careful way he was offering me his hopes like gifts, made something inside me crack open. I turned my hand over beneath his, palm to palm, and squeezed his fingers. "I'd like that," I said. "All of it." Chris's smile was radiant. He lifted our joined hands and pressed a soft kiss to my knuckles, the gesture so tender it made my eyes burn. "We don't have to figure it all out tonight," he said. "We can take it slow as you need." I nodded, not trusting my voice. The relief of finally admitting what had been building between us was overwhelming, but so was the terror of having something real to lose again. "Will you stay?" Chris asked, his voice uncertain. I just mean here on the couch, with me, just to be close to someone for a while." The request was so simple and so honest that it made my chest ache. When was the last time someone had asked me to stay just for the pleasure of my company? When was the last time I'd wanted to? "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I'll stay." Chris's face lit up like I'd given him the moon. He reached for the throw blanket draped over the back of the couch and unfolded it, settling it over both our legs. The gesture was domestic and comfortable in a way that should have felt presumptuous, but instead felt like coming home. We adjusted ourselves on the couch, settling into a position that was close but not overwhelming, our sides touching, Chris's arm along the back of the couch behind my shoulders, my hand still loosely held in his. The bourbon had left us both warm and slightly loose-limbed, and the combination of that and the steady rain was deeply soothing.
"Tell me something else," I said, turning my head to look at him. "Something I don't know about you." Chris considered this, his free hand absently playing with the hem of the blanket. "I wanted to be a writer when I was younger," he said, "before I became a firefighter. I used to write these terrible short stories and submit them to magazines, collect rejection letters like they were badges of honor." "What kind of stories?" "Oh, deeply melodramatic stuff about lonely men finding connection in unexpected places," he said with a self-deprecating laugh. "Looking back, they were probably thinly veiled wish fulfillment." "What made you stop writing?" Chris was quiet for a moment. Life, I guess. Marriage, work, trying to be what everyone expected me to be. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that writing was selfish, that it was time to focus on more practical things. There was sadness in his voice, the particular melancholy that comes from abandoned dreams. I squeezed his hand. "Do you ever miss it?" I asked. "More than I expected to," he admitted. "Especially lately. There's something about being around you that makes me want to pay attention to things again, to notice the small moments and find ways to capture them. The idea that my presence in his life had rekindled something creative and meaningful in him was both thrilling and humbling. Maybe you should start again," I said. "Writing, I mean." Chris turned to look at me, his eyes searching my face. "You think so?" "I think you should do whatever makes you feel alive," I said. "Life's too short to abandon the things that matter to you." "What about you?" he asked. "Is there anything you abandoned that you miss?" The question caught me off guard, and I had to think about it. So much of my adult life had been about maintenance rather than growth, about getting by rather than thriving. "Music," I said finally. "I used to play guitar. Nothing professional, just for myself. But I haven't touched one in years." "Why did you stop?" I shrugged, though the gesture felt hollow. "Same reason as you, probably. Life got in the way, and it started feeling like a luxury I couldn't afford." "We're a pair, aren't we?" Chris said with a wry smile. "Two people who forgot how to want things for themselves." "Maybe we can remember together," I suggested, the words coming out before I could second-guess them. The look Chris gave me then was so full of hope and affection that it made my heart stutter. "I'd like that," he said softly. "I'd like that a lot." We fell into comfortable silence again, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. The rain had slowed to barely a whisper, and the house felt incredibly peaceful around us. I found myself studying Chris's profile in the lamplight, the strong line of his jaw, the slight crinkles around his eyes that spoke of years of genuine smiles, the way his lips curved naturally upward even in repose. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, catching me looking. "How different this feels," I said honestly. "Being here with you. Usually when I'm with someone, I'm thinking about what I should say next, or whether I'm being too much or not enough. But with you, I just am." Chris's thumb traced across my knuckles again, a gesture that was becoming wonderfully familiar. "I know what you mean," he said. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for you to realize I'm not as interesting as you thought or that this is too complicated to be worth it." "And yet here we are," I said. "Here we are," he agreed. I shifted slightly, turning more fully toward him, and realized how close we'd grown during the course of our conversation. Our faces were maybe 6 inches apart, close enough that I could see the tiny scar above his left eyebrow and feel the warmth of his breath when he spoke. "Chris," I said, his name feeling important on my tongue. "Yeah?" I wanted to say something profound, something that would capture the magnitude of what was happening between us, but all I could manage was, "Thank you." "For what?" "For asking me to stay. For being patient with me. For making me feel like I matter." The expression that crossed Chris's face was so tender it made my throat tight. He lifted his free hand and brushed his fingers along my cheek, the touch feather light, but electric. "You do matter," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "More than you know." The air between us seemed to thicken, charged with possibility and want, and the terrifying prospect of finally letting someone close. Chris's hand was still cupping my cheek, his thumb tracing along my cheekbone, and I found myself leaning into the touch despite every instinct that told me to pull back. "Is this okay?" he whispered, his eyes searching mine. Instead of answering with words, I covered his hand with mine, pressing his palm more firmly against my face. The gesture was answer enough. Chris's pupils dilated and his breathing grew shallow.
We stayed frozen like that for a moment, balanced on the edge of something that would change everything between us. I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat, could see the rapid rise and fall of Chris's chest beneath his worn t-shirt. "I want to kiss you," he said, the words barely audible. "I've wanted to for months." The confession sent heat flooding through me, pooling low in my belly. "I want that too," I whispered back. Chris leaned closer, moving with careful deliberation, giving me every opportunity to pull away if I changed my mind. But pulling away was the last thing I wanted to do. Instead, I met him halfway, my eyes fluttering closed as his lips brushed mine. The first touch was tentative, questioning, soft and warm and achingly gentle. Chris kissed like he was afraid I might disappear if he pressed too hard, like he was trying to memorize the taste and texture of my mouth. I could taste the bourbon on his lips, could smell his cologne and the faint scent of rain that clung to both of us. When we broke apart, it was only to breathe. Chris rested his forehead against mine, his hand still cupping my face, and I could feel him trembling slightly. "Okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "More than okay," I managed, my own voice not entirely steady. This time when he kissed me, there was more certainty in it, more heat. His lips moved against mine with growing confidence, and I found myself opening to him, letting him deepen the kiss until we were both breathing hard and clutching at each other. When we finally broke apart for real, Chris pulled back to look at me, his eyes dark and wondering. "Jesus," he breathed. "That was—" "Yeah," I agreed, still trying to catch my breath. Chris smiled then, slow and amazed, and I thought I'd never seen anything more beautiful. "Come here," he said softly, opening his arms. I didn't hesitate. I settled against his chest, my head on his shoulder, and felt his arms close around me with the kind of security I hadn't experienced in years. He was warm and solid, and I could hear his heartbeat gradually slowing to match mine. "This is nice," I murmured against his collarbone. "It is," Chris agreed, his hand stroking up and down my back. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up." "If you do, don't tell me about it," I said, making him chuckle. We settled deeper into the couch, adjusting until we were both comfortable with me curled against Chris's side and his arms wrapped securely around me. The throw blanket covered us both, and the last of the rain finally stopped, leaving the world outside quiet and clean. "What happens now?" I asked, the question that had been lurking in the back of my mind finally making its way to the surface. Chris was quiet for a moment, his fingers still tracing patterns on my back. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'd like to take you on a proper date. I'd like to see where this goes when we're not both terrified of our own feelings." "I'd like that too," I said, surprised by how much I meant it. "We can take it slow," Chris said again. "There's no rush." I tilted my head up to look at him. "What if I don't want to take it that slow?" The heat that flared in Chris's eyes made my pulse quicken, but his voice remained steady. "Then we'll figure it out as we go," he said. "Together." The word "together" sent warmth spreading through my chest. When was the last time I'd had a together? When was the last time I'd even wanted one? I settled back against Chris's chest, feeling more content than I had in years. Outside, the world was quiet and still, washed clean by the rain. Inside, something new was beginning, fragile and precious and full of possibility. "Stay with me tonight?" Chris asked quietly, his voice uncertain again. "Just like this? I don't want this to end yet." "Neither do I admitted. So we stayed. We talked quietly about small things, favorite movies, childhood memories, the books we'd loved and lost. We dozed intermittently, waking to find ourselves still tangled together, still safe in the warm circle of lamplight and shared understanding. As the night deepened toward dawn, I found myself thinking about all the chances I'd let pass by, all the moments I'd chosen safety over possibility. For years, I'd convinced myself that wanting less meant hurting less, but lying there in Chris's arms, I realized I'd been wrong. The absence of hurt wasn't the same thing as the presence of joy. "Chris?" I whispered into the darkness. I'm scared," I admitted. His arms tightened around me. "Of this? Of us? Of how much I want this to work," I said. "Of how much I want you to stay." Chris pressed a kiss to the top of my head. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly. "Not unless you ask me to." "Promise." "Promise." I closed my eyes and let myself sink fully into the moment, the weight of Chris's arms around me, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the incredible luxury of being held by someone who wanted nothing from me except my presence. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to touch the horizon, but neither of us moved to acknowledge it. We had found something rare and precious in the space between night and morning, and we were both reluctant to let the outside world intrude on it. Whatever came next, dates and conversations and the slow, careful work of building something real together, would have to wait for daylight. For now, it was enough to lie together in the gentle darkness, two people who had been alone for too long finally allowing themselves to hope for something more. The rain had stopped, but the promise of clear skies ahead felt tentative, uncertain. Like everything worthwhile, what we'd found would require care and patience and no small amount of faith. But as Chris's breathing evened out beside me, and I felt myself drifting toward sleep in the safety of his arms, I thought maybe, just maybe, I was ready to be brave enough to try.